Thank you for plugging into this Family Life News podcast, streaming issues-driven, family-focused news.
Welcome back to another edition of Real Answers with Christopher Anderson. Wednesdays, during the Noon Report, we tackle the tough topics facing today's families with licensed mental health counselor Christopher Anderson. And if there was ever a topic that all of us as Christians can relate to, it's probably managing our doubts with regards to our faith.
That's so true, Brandon. And, it's one of those topics that probably needs to be revisited periodically because life will continue to happen and the enemy will attack. And, of course, he wants us to question our faith and ultimately our God. And that was the enemy's plan from the early days back in the Garden of Eden.
Chris, as a Christian counselor, how often does this topic come up?
It actually comes up more often than people realize. And even when a client isn't necessarily making the connection between anxiety or their fears with doubt, I think through discussion, and sometimes this happens, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes those connections can then be made, and then now not only whatever issues are bringing the client into the office, but we can also address doubts and then strengthen their faith in the process as well. Also, legalism can play a really big part in this equation as well. It's almost like an intensifier, if you want to call it that. For example, someone who was brought up in a very legalistic family or a church background can have a very difficult time just understanding what it means to rest in God's omniscience, in His grace and in the finished work of what was done on the cross. And when that happens, it can be very easy to pick up the yoke of fear and anxiety. Now, part of this, too, might be just not understanding how God works in one's life and not realizing that His perspective is far different and much more insightful for obvious reasons than our own. So someone who was having a difficult time understanding why something is happening to them or why things aren't working out the way they'd like it, is that they're losing sight that God is working behind the scenes in a very powerful way and for our best interest, okay? And because we can't see it or understand it, it's very tempting for us to believe that He doesn't care or, in extreme situations that He's just truly not there. Then with these thoughts running through our minds, it's far too easy then to be anxious and depressed and then really apply that anxiety and depression. And then we can see why our lives take a turn for the worse.
As a counselor, how do you walk someone through the process of dealing with doubt?
Well, I think the first step is to remember how Jesus interacted with Thomas following Christ's resurrection. I think that it's so important to see God's true character and how God sees us through that one interaction. And He understands our limitations, our fallenness, our earthly nature, if you will. And it's not to condemn, but to encourage. So remember that there was Thomas and Jesus. Jesus was back. He rose again. He's in the flesh. And there's Thomas still doubting. Thomas was standing there looking at Christ, and he's still doubting. So Jesus was like, here's my hands. Touch and see. This whole interaction can be found in the Gospel of John, chapter 20. He wasn't there shaking his head and thinking, you poor fool, I'm so ashamed and so disappointed in you. No, he said, here you go. Now believe. And implicit in that now belief is allow that belief to now guide your life and guide how you interact through your relationship with Christ and through your relationship with God. That's what Thomas did. So after we see this interaction, we need to remember that Jesus sees us the same way, with love and with understanding and compassion, and He realizes that we're limited in our abilities to see things from His perspective. So when somebody comes to me is struggling with doubt, and then that translates into anxiety and fear or even depression, it's important to get those beliefs and those fears, turn them into words, turn them into statements, and put them on paper, because when you do that, you can truly dissect those beliefs and replace them with accurate, biblical-based thoughts, ones that cause us to refocus on the truth of Scripture. And as is often the case, based in evidence from a client's very own past, they can see that God has been there and has worked things out. So then it's a matter of getting clients to be able to remind themselves to focus on the truthful statements, on these new thoughts, and not return to the old fears and thoughts. And that's a bit of a process. It does take time because they are habits of thoughts that need time to, the new stuff to take effect. So if somebody is in a small group and being part of a small group through a Bible-believing church, this is a great way to deal with doubts, open up a discussion. And again, if there is any small group leaders listening right now, it's so important to foster an environment that is non-judgmental and it's understanding when folks come in and want to open up and share about their doubts, instead of kind of callously throwing out Scripture in somewhat unthoughtful ways, because, again, that can have the opposite effect of chasing people away when they're trying to be vulnerable and truly deal with their doubts.
You've been listening to another edition of Real Answers with Christopher Anderson. Wednesdays during the Noon Report, we tackle the tough topics facing today's families with Christian counselor Christopher Anderson.